There are three wonderful verses without which the rest of the Bible just doesn't make sense. But if you know about them, then the whole story of the Bible, right through to eternity, becomes crystal clear. Now, I'm going to show you how these verses give you a theological framework that will help you understand where any passage of the Bible fits into the whole storyline. It's going to be good. So in this series, we're walking through the storyline of the Bible using this framework. And the three verses we're going to look at are near the beginning of Genesis. But before we get to them, we need to look at what's happened so far. So the Bible started with God creating the whole universe, a perfect kingdom of which he was the king, with Adam and Eve living under his rule and blessing in total harmony. Now, the kingdom was kind of like a blueprint, a pattern to be echoed in the future. But tragically, then comes the fall. Adam and Eve mutiny against God's good rule and are cursed with death and banished. Following, mankind spirals into rebellion and murder and wickedness. It seems as if God's good creation has been undone. But then into the darkness comes these amazing words. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God speaks to Abraham, who's just this normal guy. Hang on, in Genesis 12, he's actually called Abram. I think you've made a little mistake there, Zoe. Thanks, yes, God does change his name from Abram to Abraham, but I'll stick with Abraham because otherwise it's just gonna get too complicated. So Abraham is born in Ur, which is a place near Babylon, kind of way east of Canaan. And he's 75 years old when, with his dad, he moves westwards to Haran. And then out of the blue, God speaks to him. Hello, Boffin Zoe here to help out when normal Zoe needs a little bit of theological help. Now, can I just point out that if you read the Bible, it seems as if God is constantly speaking to people, but there's centuries when he's silent. So far in the Bible, God's only recorded speaking to Adam and Eve, and then their son Cain, and then Noah. And according to Luke's gospel, it's at least 21 generations from Adam to Abraham, i.e. absolutely ages. So God speaking to Abraham is a really big deal. Thanks. So God says to him, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. So this is an instruction which becomes a promise of a place to live, and it's filled in Genesis 13 and 15 and 17. And we can begin to see how these promises link to what's been said before. So the word land here is the same as the one God used in Eden in his blessing to Adam and Eve. He said, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, that's the land, and subdue it. So this promise to Abraham seems to be a reversal of the fall's curse on the land that leads to toil. And instead, God is indicating to this old guy miles from home that he's gonna fix this curse and he's gonna return humanity to a new Eden. Go to the land I will show you. Hey, does that mean that the Bible is like one of those adventure quest stories? Yes, exactly. This makes this storyline super exciting. You see, the Bible is an epic journey story. If it was a film, it could have the subtitle Return to Eden. God's people finding the way back to God's land. And do you know, in the New Testament, the writer to the Hebrews picks up on this. Talking of Abraham and co, the writer says they understood the significance of this promise of a land as they traipsed about the Middle East. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And can I also say that I find this promise of a place incredibly encouraging, that God has prepared a place for me in heaven. You see, I'm a Brit that emigrated to Australia a few years ago, and my home is tens of thousands of miles away back in the UK, away from where I live, and I do get homesick. But like Abraham, I know God's got a better country in store for me. No offense, Australia. Okay, what's next? Now, in Eden, Adam and Eve lived in perfect relationship with God and each other. But at the fall, all this went pear-shaped. Those relationships were broken. And by Genesis 12 at Babel, rebellious humanity was scattered by God. Society was entirely fragmented. God's people were no more. But now to Abraham, God's on a roll. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. He promises to establish human society on its proper basis. God with his people again. And looking ahead to the New Testament, 1 Peter reiterates this wonderful promise to God's people, now called the church. But you are a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. How exactly Abraham is going to be the father of this nation when he and his wife are childless and in their 70s is not clear at this point, but we'll come to that in a minute. In Eden, God looked at all he had made and it was very good. There was blessing under God's rule, but the curse of Genesis 3 undid this. To dust you will return as the judgment of death entered the world. But now, a huge reversal, a tsunami of blessing. I will bless you and I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now this is huge. Whilst it's directed at Abraham, I will bless you, it's not just Abraham's family, Israel, that will receive the blessing, but all peoples on earth. That means all the families, all the nations will be blessed. And that includes you and me. So these epic promises to little old Abraham will reverse the curse and return us to a new version of Eden. And that's why these verses are some of the most important in the whole of the Bible. You see, God is giving us a promise of the new kingdom that he's going to create. Now, I've called it, rather inventively, the promised kingdom. So God's people in God's place under God's rule and blessing. And if you do nothing else, just remember those 3 things. Now, let me tell you, as I said at the beginning, how powerful these promises are for Bible interpretation. You see, wherever you are in the Bible storyline, you can take these 3 things and you can ask, well, where is God at with his fulfillment of them? How's he going with his promise of a people or a place or blessing and rule? You see, it's a brilliant framework for understanding the entire Bible. Hang on. I've heard that God works through covenants, but here you've called them promises. So which one is it? Good question. Well, a covenant is a formal, solemn commitment used in the ancient world. And for us, the equivalent might be signing legal contracts or a marriage ceremony. And with Abraham, God's covenant formalizes the promises which were already made. Yes, let's see how these promises get formalized in a covenant as the story goes on. Okay, so during the next few years, Abraham arrives in Canaan, then he goes down to Egypt, and then he returns. And we get to Genesis 15, and it's covenant time. But no one's getting out a contract and a fountain pen. It's much more exciting than that. And the clue is in the verb for what you do with a covenant. You see, interestingly, in Hebrew, you don't make a covenant, you cut one, which is what God does here. So Abraham has to get a bunch of animals and then he has to cut them in half and lay them out in 2 rows. And then normally both parties are to walk between the carcasses to say, if I break this covenant, let my future be like these animals, i.e. chopped in half. But listen up to this. In this covenant, after Abraham lays out the animals, well, he falls asleep. And when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared. Now the fire signifies God, and he appears like this again at Mount Sinai. So the firepot with the blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants I give this land. Now, what was strange about that covenant, except the dead animals and all that stuff? Did you notice who walked between the carcasses? I am listening. It was just God. Yeah, Abraham was asleep, and amazingly, it was just God cutting the covenant. Think about that for a moment. The God of the universe, who has no needs, unilaterally commits himself to his rebellious creatures with promises he never needed to make. And effectively, in doing so, he's saying he alone will pay the penalty of death if he doesn't follow through on his promises. So this covenant is bilateral. It's unconditional for Abraham, but it is conditional for God. But what about Abraham later having to do circumcision as part of the covenant? What's that about? Well, yes, later Abraham is instructed to do circumcision in Genesis 17 as a sign of the covenant. But the covenant was already in place for over a decade before that. And remember, God was the only one walking through the pieces. So what is Abraham's part in these promises? Well, it's clearly not perfect behaviour. All the patriarchs, i.e. that means Abraham and his immediate descendants, although they're kind of Bible celebrities, are actually all shockers, including Abraham. For example, when Abraham was in Egypt, he lied and he farmed out Sarah, his wife, to Pharaoh to avoid Abraham being killed. And then years later, he does it again with a different king. And another time, he let Sarah persuade him to sleep with her maidservant to produce an heir. So Abraham definitely isn't the recipient of the promise because he's a good person or he's got a perfect record of trusting God. But what Abraham does demonstrate, despite his failings, is faith. You see, Abraham's big demonstration of faith is that he gets up and goes. He leaves his home and he goes to the land God says, and he continues to have faith when he gets there because until the day he dies, he's always a foreigner. His family won't own the land for another 400 years. It also takes a lot of faith to believe that at 75, you and your childless wife are going to have a baby. And even more so at 99 years old, when Abraham's been waiting 24 years and still no baby. It's at this point that God introduces the circumcision as a sign of the covenant. Can I just say, not to get into the gruesome details, but circumcision seems such a weird sign to pick for a covenant. No, actually, it's a great sign for a promise about people or offspring or seed, get it? Because if God has promised, I'm going to give you loads of descendants, then it totally makes sense to have a reminder of the promise in the zone of your body most related to having babies. And also, and this is serious, this sign needed to involve blood. Now, a sign isn't the real thing. It doesn't do anything. It's just pointing to something else. And, another spoiler alert, we'll have to wait almost 2 millennia before we see what that is. You see, the blood shed at circumcision is fulfilled actually when Jesus is put to the sword, as it were, for us. It's to make us God's people. This is when we finally see how a holy God can make unconditional covenants with sinful people. He fulfills the conditions he requires in himself, in Jesus. Now, moving on with Abraham's story, there's a really interesting episode after Abraham returns from Egypt in Genesis 13 to 14. You see, Abraham and his nephew Lot have amassed loads of sheep and they've parted ways. So Lot takes the good grazing pastures. This is where he goes, in the Jordan Valley, near evil Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham is left with the higher land in Canaan. And in Genesis 14, we learn that a group of powerful kings from the northeast, kind of Babylon direction, have been oppressing the 5 local kings around where Lot is stationed. Now, the local kings rebel, but the 4 eastern kings are not having this, and they effect a massive attack, and they sweep down past the Jordan River, past the Dead Sea, and up through the Negev. And so the 5 local kings move north, and they battle them in the salt plains near Sodom. And the local kings get routed. And some of the people fall into tar pits, some retreat to the hills, but many get kidnapped. And Lot and his family, who now realise they've made a really dangerous choice living so close to Sodom, they get taken with the other kidnapped people as war spoil over 180 kilometres away up north near Damascus. Now, imagine it. It is really, really bad for Lot. Now, 80-year-old Abraham, who's been safely out of the way in Canaan, hears news about Lot, and he musters 3 allies and over 300 trained men. Now, this sounds a lot, but they would have been dwarfed by the 4 eastern kings with their proven armies who've beaten all the territories they've attacked. But Abraham is the recipient of the promise. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. You see, Abraham knows God's blessing is for his family, and that includes Lot. So Lot staying kidnapped is probably unlikely to be part of God's plan. So Abraham covers the 180 kilometres and they attack at night, and he defeats the 4 kings and he chases them beyond Damascus, and so recovers Lot, and not some, but miraculously all the stolen goods and people. I'm sorry, but the Bible is full of stories of God's people winning battles. Why is this one so special? Well, just stop for a second. Firstly, this is the first time in the Bible we've seen God in action in war, and it tells us who God is. It's telling us that God is a king. Now, the primary role of a king in the ancient world wasn't to wear a crown and it wasn't to do charitable work, but it was to fight wars to defend his country. Well, this story is a battle of kings. The 5 kings around Sodom versus the 4 kings from the east versus the one true victorious king of the world, Abraham's God. And to hammer the point home, the mysterious priest king Melchizedek gives the post-match analysis when the dust settles. Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. So we're seeing the promise of blessing beginning to unfold as God the King protects his people from their enemies. And it must have taken faith for Abraham to go and chase those 4 kings, just as it took faith for Abraham to look at the stars and believe God against all the physical evidence that God would give him a son. Which is why Abraham believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. Now, theologically, Abraham is really, really important in the Bible because he's the OG demonstration of the way that we are supposed to respond to God. And Paul quotes this verse in Romans 4. You see, true faith is trusting God's word in his promises, just like Abraham. Now, true faith obviously leads to action, so like moving to a foreign land or waiting decades for a child or embarking on a dangerous rescue mission. But those actions are just the outworking of the faith in the promise, not the reason God makes the promise in the first place. And because of Abraham's trust, God credits him with a righteousness that he doesn't actually have. But how is that fair? How can God say Abraham is righteous when he's actually sinful? Remember what he did to Sarah twice? Well, God doesn't say Abraham is righteous, rather he credits him as righteous. And, a final spoiler alert, it's not till we get to the New Testament and Jesus' death on the cross do we see how this can actually be fair. You see, Abraham is credited with a righteousness he doesn't have because he believes in the early promises of the gospel, which are ultimately fulfilled by Jesus being Abraham's substitute. Jesus is being credited with Abraham's sins and dies for them. That's why it's fair. And at the time, Abraham doesn't know explicitly how the promises will pan out, but his simple trust is enough for God to credit him as righteous. And in all of this, and this is the take-home point for each of us, God saves by grace, not works. Abraham's a ratbag at times, but he has faith. And that's how we relate to God too, not through our good deeds, not through the things that we do to impress God, but through trusting that he'll come through with his promises. Phew. So that is the promised kingdom. Let's have a look at where we are in God's storyline. So we've had creation, the blueprint kingdom, and then the fall. And now we're at this new stage, the promised kingdom. And we've now got an explicit set of promises. God's people, with the immediate context meaning Abraham's descendants, in God's place, so the promise of the land of Canaan, under God's rule and blessing, which promise is given to both Israel and the worldwide nations. And we can now carry forward these promises to any part of the Bible and ask, as we've said before, what is God doing with them to understand how this passage fits into the whole storyline? It's super helpful, yeah? So what's next? Well, from the rest of Genesis through to the book of Kings, we'll see how God begins to fulfill these promises in the history of Israel. But there's some major hiccups along the way, particularly because all of Abraham's descendants are generally scumbags in one way or another, and most of the women are childless into old age. But as always, God finds a way. So check out this video if you want to find out what happens next, or look at this one if you want an overview of the whole story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. I'll see you there.